Continuing this Barebow Form Series, we are going to talk about the act of loading or drawing the bow back and the actual load position. So yeah, this is a continuation of my Barebow Form Series explaining to you how to use the NTS System or the KSL Shot Cycle for Barebow Archery. I've already done a recurve form series, which I will have links in the description below, and I will also have links in the description below plus a card at the top up there for you to check out for the playlist for this Barebow Form Series. So if you haven't seen those other videos yet, I would start there and then progress into this one. So in this video, we are going to talk about the loading and the load position. So we've already gone through set position, stance and posture, hook and grip, as well as the set to setup movement plus the setup position. And now we are getting into the phase of drawing the bow back to load the bow right before we come into anchor. So just like every other video, I will make sure that I explain to you how I had learned the NTS system from my coach, Kaminski, and show you how to apply it to Barebow, and make sure that I am talking about all of the tiny little nuances and small little changes that you will need to make sure that you do in order to properly apply it to Barebow. Really quick before we get into it, check out my Barebow specific apparel. I have links in the description below for this Barebow repeat shirt and some others, as well as there should be a little slider across the bottom of the actual video if you're on a desktop that shows you all of the Barebow specific apparel that I've got. And all the support there helps grow this channel, and it allows me to produce more of this free content for you and everybody else to absorb around the world. So loading the bow or drawing the bow back is pretty straightforward. It's just basically pulling the bow back. You know, we've gotten to the point of where we have set up position, which is somewhere in this neighborhood, somewhere around here. And we're going to then start to draw the bow back into our anchor position. Now, there are definitely some things that need to be modified within the standard KSL Shot Cycle or NTS system because we anchor very differently with a barebow. Instead of anchoring down here under the chin when we would load straight under the chin where the string hits the corner of our chin and then we come up into anchor, it is much different when we are shooting barebow because of the style of anchor that we are using. My anchor is a little lower than further back than the majority of barebow shooters. It's just more comfortable for me, but you know, even if you have this high and forward anchor where you're kind of touching your canine on this right side, pretty much everything will apply to that as well. You just have to tweak it slightly different than I'm referencing here. Sorry, I had to move the camera. There's a whole bunch of ants that were walking right under me, and I didn't want to get assaulted by some very large fire ants down here in Florida. So the main principle on how to draw the bow back is to use a lot of power, a natural movement that just about every human does when doing a very particular movement that the vast majority of people would do if you gave them a certain tool in their hand. That tool would be something like a lawnmower, a weed whacker, or something along those lines that has a small engine with a pull cord to start it. And basically the type of movement that you use to start those implements is how you pull the bow back. At least that is the easiest way for me to suggest how to draw the bow back. Now I will show you how not to draw the bow back really quick, and you'll see why nobody pull starts a lawnmower this way, because your arms would simply fall off. So if you go back to set up position here and I were to pull the bow back like you should not do, where you're using your bicep and you're kind of curling your bicep to get into position like this, that is not how to pull the bow back, and that is not how you would pull start a lawnmower, right? If you put your arm on the little, you know, the hand guard there for you to hold on to, and then you were to pull like this, your arm would fall off by the time that thing ever started, especially if you let that carb gum up because you used ethanol gas. So anybody who has run any small implement for a long period of time, when you really need to rebuild that carburetor, you're sitting there yanking on the pull starter, trying to get that thing to start forever, and doing it like this would never ever fire. You get there and you rip that thing back. You really pull and use your entire body. You use your entire core and your large muscles and your body mass to pull that engine to start. So the way I pull a bow back is very, very similar to how you would pull start a lawnmower. So if I go from set to set up and I go to pull the bow back, I am pulling the bow like I would pull start a lawnmower or a weed whacker, like this, right? So pull the bow back with power and really, really high levels of efficiency, drawing the bow back. Now, the way you would do it traditionally, according to what Coach Lee would say, is in a angular fashion, not a linear fashion. So what does that mean? Angular versus linear. Linear would be this, right? Pulling in a straight line and trying to control everything about your body. Angular is more of a rounding motion of pulling the bow back. Linear, angular. So there's a big difference there in how you actually draw the bow back. Now, something to not be confused about is the motion of angular is what your body is doing, not what your arrow is doing. Your arrow is actually moving linear, but your body is moving angular. So if you were to watch how I would go from set up position to a recurve style loading into my anchor, you'll see that my hand or the knock of the arrow will move in a straight line. It does not move in an angular line, it moves straight. So set up, and now I go to load. See how the string in my hand move in a straight line back to my face. This is a angular motion that my body is doing, but it's a linear motion that my hand is doing. It is not a angular motion that my body does and an angular motion that my hand does. See how this is moving around? No, you move straight back to your face with your hand, but you move in an angular way with your body. The best way to explain this is to use an analogy of an oil pump, or an oil pump jet basically, from an oil field. If you've ever driven by an oil field, you see those oil derricks where there's this arm that's moving in a angular way like this, but there is a linear movement of an actual basically siphon tube that, so this moves angular and the siphon tube moves linear up and down. There's mechanical advantage there. You know, you think about squeezing pliers. If you squeeze pliers in a straight way, they move angularly to then put pressure in straight as well. Kind of the same type of thing. And we're just gonna try to apply those kind of physics using an angular motion here to make the linear motion of the arrow. So make sure you don't confuse loading angularly with moving your hand out and around. Your hand moves straight back, but the body moves rotationally or angularly. Basically, this backside hinges around your spine and you rotate as you go to draw the bow back. What that's doing is it's allowing you to use much larger muscles in your back, much larger muscles in your bicep, because you're using rhomboids, trap muscles, things like that, which are very large in your back compared to your bicep or forearm muscles for sure. The advantage of this is under pressure, whether that be at a tournament, when you're shooting with your buddies in your backyard, or if you're hunting, or anything that is a high pressure situation. Even if you're shooting practice by yourself, you've got 5 arrows in the 10 ring, that last arrow to shoot a 60, there's a lot of pressure there. And using larger muscles when your body is dumping hormones into your system, because when you're under pressure, you'll be able to control your body much better with larger muscles because they're not as affected by the hormone changes and the physiological changes within your body. That's the whole point of this NTS system and the best method, or the KSL Shot Cycle, whatever you want to call it. The whole benefit of it is to use larger muscles that are less susceptible to hormones under pressure. So typically a lot of people will talk about using your middle and lower trap muscles, the muscles back in this area, and it's not a good idea to talk about muscles at all. Yes, those are the muscles that are primarily being used more than other muscles, or at least that's the end goal. But when you start talking about muscles, you can use the muscle more than you actually need to. What's really important is focusing on the movement, not the actual muscle. We've talked about this previously in other videos not related to the Barebow Form Series, but the Recurve Form Series, and that is movement versus muscles. I'll probably make a standalone video for that, but in a really quick nutshell, this is the best analogy I can use because it's very, very simple. If I think about moving my hand in this position to my face, it's simple. Just move my hand to my face. The bicep does the majority of the movement to move my hand to my face, right? Because it has to contract, and that's what bends the elbow, moves the hand closer to the face. But if I say squeeze your bicep, you can either do it the correct way and do it with minimal effort, or I can say squeeze your bicep and your hand doesn't move, because you can also flex the opposing muscle and then you are no longer moving correctly, but you're feeling your bicep more than as if you were to just move your hand to your face, okay? So the big difference is, do not talk about muscles, we need to talk about the movement, because you can get more muscle feeling without any movement, and then that gets you nowhere. So movements versus muscles, important. The main movement is moving this spot back here behind your shoulder in the posterior deltoid region, somewhere back here, which Coach Lee calls land 2, which means literally nothing other than, according to, I think, real biomechanics, there is an actual spot on the body, or at least physiology. This spot on the body is called land 1 right here. So Coach Lee said, oh, okay, if this is land 1, this is land 2. So that's why and how land 2 came about. And it's basically moving land 2, which means nothing, the posterior deltoid, around and behind you. So if I were to draw angularly, which is correct, set up position, watch my land 2, which is this spot right down here underneath this name. When I do it correctly, see how it moves a lot around and behind me that way? Now if I move linearly, see how it doesn't move a whole lot, right? But angularly, see how it moves a lot around and behind me. It's pretty obvious. Obviously I'm over exaggerating a little bit, but even if I do it how I actually shoot, set up, you can see it moves around quite dramatically. So the main movement is this spot moving around and behind you. You can think about it moving parallel to the shooting line, kind of directly behind you. That can kind of help, but it's basically just going to hinge around and behind you, and that's how you properly move during the loading phase to the load position. So now what is the actual load position? The load position is basically up to you. You know, this is Barebow. We're supposed to be having fun, and everybody's form's different. There's no right or wrong way to shoot them, because if you shoot them in the middle more than the next guy, you win, and you know, what's more simple than that? So it's not too complicated. It's up to you, and it's really going to depend on where you anchor. Because my recurve style anchor was simple, underneath my chin, it was easy to go to the load position. Load position was right here, right before anchor, right? With Barebow, it's very similar, but there's not nearly as much upward movement. For me, it's more of an inward movement into my anchor. Because the way I anchor, which we'll get to next video, because the next video is anchor, I'm right about here. So for me, what I do is I get to load about here, and then it's a combination of movements of my head coming in and my hand coming in to make a good solid anchor. So for me, I go to set up, I load, as in I'm loading, right? Drawing the bow back, right kind of near my anchor position, and then I come in with my anchor with my hand and my head in and forward all at the same time. So the movement is definitely different than Olympic style recurve, and this is where the majority of it changes, is in the anchor position itself. So you're not going to load down as far, because to load down to here to come up to anchor, that's just silly, and nobody should be doing that. So we should draw the bow back near our anchor, final anchor position, and then come into anchor solidly. The whole point of load position is to get as close to ideal alignment as possible before you even come into anchor. Because at this point, we're not supposed to be aiming yet. We're still loading, still drawing the bow back, still kind of preemptively getting ready in the early stages of the shot cycle before we start aiming. The main driving factor is to get into alignment as best as possible. Again, quickly, alignment is this shoulder to this wrist. Those three, if you can get them in a straight line, is ideal. So when I'm in the correct position at full draw, my front shoulder, back shoulder to my front wrist are pretty much in a straight line. I want to get as close to that position as I possibly can while I am in load position. And the main idea, the main principle of load is to basically really try to lock into your back. You want to get as much of that tension from your hands into your back as possible, and really leading with that land too, elbowing somebody behind you, pull starting that lawnmower, using efficient movements to then make the correct muscles fire to get into the ideal position. An analogy that you can use if you've shot compound is like how it feels when you draw back the bow. When you draw back a compound, you roll over the cams, you hit that valley, and then all of a sudden you bam, right against that wall, then you come into anchor. It's the same thing. So with compound, hit the wall, come into anchor, settle everything, level everything, and then pull, right? Well, with barebow and recurve, it's pretty much the same thing. At least you can try your best to feel that way. You really lock in, hit that wall that you want to feel, and then come into anchor. That's the ideal way to get into the load position, is to be really close to anchor, feel that back, lock it in, and then come into anchor. Now, something that I definitely would advise against is doing what I see a lot of barebow shooters do, and I'll probably ruffle some feathers out there by making this kind of statement, but I don't like that some people, when they draw back their barebow, they draw back further to then come forward into anchor. Obviously, I'm exaggerating, and that's not exactly how people do it, but people will draw a ½ inch to an inch further to then come forward and settle into their anchor. Some of them are because they're hooking their thumb behind their jaw or doing different things. But what I find that does is that it sets the ball in motion to creep and to collapse and to pluck. And the reason behind that is because if you are progressing towards a final draw position, we're at full draw, and slowly progressing forwards, you're going to continue to go that way or have a tendency to go that way. Whereas if you go past that to come this way, to then maybe come this way, by the time you start to aim and you're fighting and you're starting to falter and fall back that way, and then that's where this creeping and plucking and collapsing comes into play. So I wouldn't really advise to draw back further to come into anchor. Again, that's an exaggeration, but a lot of barebow shooters do that, and I think that causes a lot of creeping and ultimately collapsing and plucking when you go to release the string. So I prefer to build into the draw. So every time I go from set to set up, loading, anchor, transfer, and so on, I am slowly moving towards the end goal of being at full draw exactly how I want to be. I don't go past it to then come back to it. I think it just disrupts the momentum, for lack of better terms. So for me, the actual load position is very, very similar to where I am when I'm anchoring. The string is just about to touch the tip of my nose because it does while I'm at full draw. So if you're off to the side of your nose, you're gonna wanna get really close to that before you come into anchor. I'm really, really close with my hand to my anchor spot. I just have to move my head that last little bit and move my hand in that last little bit. So that's definitely different than Olympic style recurve, is that I don't think that you don't need to move your head. Olympic style recurve, not moving your head throughout the entire shot, including release and follow through, is important. With barebow, I don't think it's necessarily as important, and I think it's kind of impossible because of the odd anchor positions that we are using while shooting barebow and string walking. So don't be afraid to move your head slightly, but the main goal would be to move your head as little as possible. Again, you're disturbing the kind of the flow of the shot. You're in the wrong position to then come into the right position. So why be so far away when you could just get it close and then make that last little adjustment at the end? At least that's the way I would advise doing it. Sorry, I'm out here sweating in the sun. It's a warm day in Florida again as usual, so excuse me wiping my face. I had to move again in the shade. It's a little better. Anyway, loading. So something that I have noticed that I needed to change on how I was actually loading when I switched to barebow. Actually, I didn't discover it, my wife did, so big thanks to Heather. She noticed that I wasn't really engaging as much in my back, and my scapula wasn't coming around and down nearly as much as it used to, like when I shot Olympic style recurve, right? So Olympic style recurve, as I would draw, my scapula really would come down and around and kind of really close to my spine and really be really snug fitting against the spine. and it felt really good, and it was a very strong, efficient position to be in, and when I went to shoot, the release was very explosive. But with Barebow, what I found, or actually what she found, was that my scapula set higher up on my back and a little bit further from my spine. There wasn't as much of the lower trap engagement. Yes, I know I'm breaking my rule about talking about muscles, but because I'm not focusing on the muscles, I can talk about the muscles and say I was having less lower trap engagement than how I now have it because of a slight modification. So the slight modification is to really make sure that I'm not just moving land 2 around and behind me, but I'm also right at the very end trying to depress it down just a little bit. Not straight down, but instead of the angle moving this way around me, at the very end I would kind of just do that. Just a little bit of a dip at the end, just to kind of really make sure that as I was loading, coming around, that scapula would hinge down and in, just like it did with Olympic style recurve. So from the front, it looks more like this, right? So I'm coming up, set up, loading, and I'm like really locking in low. So loading, anchor. The old way was just to kind of draw back and stay up a little higher. You can see my elbow's a little higher here versus the new way, it's a little lower. So I'll face the other way and you'll see the difference. This is the old way. So you'll see the scapula is up and high, right? Up and high. Now, if I load the new way, which is again kind of around and behind, but at the very end, just kind of tapering down, just that little bit. It's kind of what that feels like. So set up. And I'm in my Barebow anchor here. So Barebow anchor. But my scapula is really down and low, and it's kind of hinged in more. So, you know, if you're switching from Olympic style recurve to Barebow, that's something that you should probably just pay attention to. If you're new to Barebow and new to trying this type of form, you know, that the best way that I can explain it is this, just kind of coming around and a little bit of down, just kind of settling into it a little bit. It's like, it's so small. It's such a small change, and it's just a slight change in tension. Now, what might help if you've never shot Olympic style recurve is to try an Olympic style anchor. Try to load into the Olympic style anchor instead of your Barebow anchor. So Barebow anchor, yeah, up here, but load down and under more, and come into anchor under your chin like this, and kind of just feel what it feels like in your back. Feel the position that it feels like, and now try to emulate it with a Barebow anchor. As we are loading and drawing the bow back, we're also having to add and reach in the front half. You know, setup position, I've already said that it's basically reaching as far as you can. That helps drive the alignment, but also as you're loading, kind of reaching and pulling at the same time, where this moves forward and this moves back, all at the same time, just like when you're pull starting a lawnmower, you're pushing forward as you're pulling back, all in the same motion. It's that same type of movement. Now, it's not as explosive as pull starting a lawnmower. It's a lot slower and more controlled of a movement, but the actual movement itself is very, very similar. Another way you can kind of think about it is to think about this spot and pulling the bow back here, not pulling the bow back here. That's an easy way to move more in the correct direction, or with the correct movements, using the correct muscles, is to think about focusing on the land 2, the posterior deltoid, whatever you want to call it, back here, and move that around and behind you correctly. And this hand will move in a straight line. You'll use the correct muscles, and everything will be much better overall. So not focusing on here or here. When you do that, this tends to happen. Pulling more with the hand, pulling more linearly, and not moving your deltoid around. So if I think about pulling the string, this happens. If I think about using my shoulder, this happens. There's a big difference there, and one is way stronger than the other. Earlier I mentioned not to be aiming yet, and again, it's the same just like Olympic style recurve. Aiming doesn't happen until after transfer, and that's a couple more steps down the road, so we're not quite there yet. If you're really interested in seeing the rest of this form series and a lot of other videos that I'm doing specific for archery, please hit that subscription button and the notification bell. That way you're notified every time I upload a new video. I'm working on producing this video to its finish, and I am eventually going to be shooting traditional style archery and doing a form series for traditional style archery as well, because I just placed an order for a traditional bow. So that's very exciting. My first ever one that is actually mine that I get to play with, and it'll be very exciting and fun. So I've got a lot of stuff that's going to be coming out in the future. I've done a lot of equipment testing, and I'm trying to produce a lot of good quality free coaching content essentially for everybody to absorb. And like I said, purchasing apparel, checking out my website jakekaminski.com, where you can book coaching sessions both in person as well as digitally. I do face-to-face calls through Google Hangouts, and I also do something that is called video coaching review, where essentially you send me some videos of you shooting, and then I sit down at my computer, film myself, and record feedback on how to shoot, and you know, you can get some good quality coaching. So if you're interested in being coached by me, head to my website, jakekaminski.com. There will be links in the description below, and I will have a card at the top up there for you to check out. Also, if you're interested in learning more about the KSL Shot Cycle, the NTS System, or the best method, depending on when and where you're from and how you got into archery, I will have links in the description below on where you can grab Total Archery Inside the Archer. It's written by my coach, Keesick Lee, as well as an old teammate of mine, Tyler Benner. And it's a really, really good resource of information on how to do everything related to this style of shooting. There are lots and lots of pages in full color showing you exact step-by-step details on how to apply it to Olympic style recurve, but I'm showing you here the little tweaks and tricks for barebow archery. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this video, consider hitting the subscription button and the notification bell, as well as the like button. I would appreciate it. Also, please consider supporting my channel. If you head to my website, jakekaminski.com, there'll be info and links on Patreon, apparel, books, and equipment sales, PayPal donate button, a P.O. box to send things to, and above all else, please share this video because there's no better advertising than word of mouth.